So in today's video, we're going to be answering the question, is the Separate Ways DLC for Resident Evil 4 Remake worth buying? Now, right before we answer that question, it is worth noting that, the first part of this review is going to be spoiler free, but once we get into the spoiler section, we will be going more into detail. I will be explaining the things that I love about this DLC, the nitpicks that I had with it, and then finally we'll get to my final review score. And now going back to answering the question, yes, if you have not bought Separate Ways, I highly recommend that you go ahead and purchase this, since you know what, there's so much content in this small DLC. It's actually a bit shocking. A lot of people on Twitter, a lot of people in the Resident Evil community have been talking about this. I've been seeing some tweets. A lot of people are kind of comparing the Separate Ways DLC to the length of Resident Evil 3 Remake. Now, what's funny about that assessment is that I kind of have to agree with it. I actually don't remember how long my first playthrough of Resident Evil 3 Remake took, but I do know that my best time, I think, was roughly around 1 hour and 45. I think it was 145 minutes. 1 hour and 45 minutes to actually beat the entirety of Resident Evil 3 Remake, and I'm not even a speedrunner, so yeah, that's that's the fastest that I got through that game after I played it a couple of times, got the platinum. But going back to Separate Ways, yeah, my first playthrough, I think it took me roughly around 5 hours and 46 minutes. I might be wrong. We actually did stream it live on the channel. We translated all of the Spanish. I'll actually leave a link to that stream playlist down in the description if you guys want to check that out later. And it is worth mentioning too that I did play it on hardcore difficulty, and my second playthrough was actually on professional difficulty, and that's actually where I got most of the footage for this review, which we'll be showcasing later on in the video. But yeah, I think that took me 3 hours and something minutes. And you know what, those are just my first two playthroughs. So for a price point and having that much fun with the game, I've had a blast playing this game without getting too much into detail, because again, this is the spoiler free section, but I highly recommend it. If anything, it kind of shocks me that Separate Ways was literally $9.99 and compared to Shadow Rose, which, correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't that like 20? I don't know if it was 15 USD. I'm in Canada, for those of you that don't know, so I'm pretty sure for me it was 20. But what's funny here is that Capcom decided to lower the price of their DLC. That's even better than the DLC that released, 2 years ago? So yeah, that's a little trippy for me, but I mean, it's good news for Resident Evil fans. Since I have seen also that there are people out there leaving bad reviews of the game that have been saying that $10 is way too much for this DLC. That's crazy. $10 to have this much fun for this many hours. You got to be crazy to not want to purchase this at that price point. And if you guys have been watching the channel for quite some time, you guys know that, yeah, I consider Shadow Rose, in my personal opinion, I think it's probably the worst DLC we've ever gotten in Resident Evil history. So this is a huge shock to me that, Capcom put the price so low. And not only that, it is worth mentioning too that even if you don't purchase this DLC, you do get the free Mercenaries update. If anything, I would actually argue that if you haven't purchased Separate Ways yet, it's definitely needed for your overall experience for Resident Evil 4 Remake, because at the end of the day, what Separate Ways does is it actually boosts what Resident Evil 4 Remake story did. But even as I mentioned in my review, a lot of the things that were missing from the Resident Evil 4 Remake story are added, those components are added into the Separate Ways DLC. So you know what, if you have Resident Evil 4 Remake and you haven't purchased Separate Ways, it's definitely needed to boost the story, and to get the full entire experience. So as mentioned, there's no real reason to not purchase Separate Ways. I highly recommend it, guys. All right, so now we're actually going to go into the spoiler section of the review. So if you guys have not played Separate Ways, again, I highly recommend you guys go play it and then come back and finish watching the review. Now, the first thing that I actually want to mention in more detail is the fact that when I started playing Separate Ways, and this is actually not something that I only noticed, but also a lot of the viewers, since we did play it live on the channel, I did notice that Ada's strength when it came to enemies was a lot weaker compared to Leon. Now, the one thing that I actually will say to this is that in the OG Separate Ways, you could argue that it was harder than the actual main game, mostly due to the fact that, Ada couldn't buy upgrades for her weapons. She could only buy weapons in that OG Separate Ways. So one of the things that I actually really liked about this DLC was the fact that you could upgrade, you could customize not only your guns, but also your abilities. Well, one of the upgrades that you can actually boost with Eder is actually by getting a charm, which was very interesting how they added that, they incorporated that mechanic into the gameplay. You know, the fact that, you know, she could, if you added the little Eder charm in the briefcase, you could literally yank shields off of enemies. I thought that was really cool that they did that. And I also really like the fact that, you know, there was also, you know, that other charm that actually boosts, you know, the attack damage, your fighting damage all in overall, which again did kind of even the playing fields, because as mentioned, when you first start playing Separate Ways, I did notice that you know, Eder was kind of weaker. And not only that, but on the other thing that I also noticed is that certain enemy types, like for example, like the Cowman or like the JJs, those types of enemies, they actually boosted their health in certain instances, which I thought was very interesting because, again, I've played so much of Resident Evil 4 Remake, and, you know, I already kind of have like a gauge of what, how much health an enemy has, but I noticed when I played it in Separate Ways, especially with Eder, I was like, dude, this guy's not dying. He's not going down, and I was shooting him a lot, you know what I mean? So it might be due to the fact that, you know, that Eder doesn't have that many weapon variety, but I would actually argue that, you know what, it seems to me like the devs, they actually made those enemy types like the Cowman or the JJs have a little more health in certain times. So in certain times, like for example, the most blatant and apparent time where I noticed this was occurring was actually in the Wrecking Ball section of the island. And my first go of that section, I died because I actually ran out of bullets. And then the second time I played it, I noticed that there was a change in the health that the JJ had. So very interesting. I don't know if you guys have noticed this. Again, this might just be me. I don't know. But you know what? Let me know down in the comments. I'm very curious to see if you guys noticed these little tweaks to like the enemy health and the enemy damage output that Eder had towards them. I don't know. It was very weird. Now, the other thing that I actually really wanted to talk about was the Pesanta fights. Like for starters, the first thing that I actually will say was I thought it was brilliant that they gave so much backstory to the other Verdugo. You know, we got information as to, you know, the name of the Verdugo. We got, you know, information that it's actually a she, right? It is a female servant that turns into that Verdugo, and her name was Pesanta. Really cool that they added those, you know, that backstory to the character of the Verdugo. So, you know, there's just a little, it just fleshes the character out more, the enemy out, I guess. But the thing I wanted to discuss was the Pesanta fights. For longtime viewers of my channel, you guys know that I do not like it when Resident Evil starts to get into the paranormal side. I've stated this in several videos before, but especially when it came to like those awful rumors regarding, you know, the Hookman, one of the things that I did not like about those rumors that were going around before Resident Evil 4 Remake's release was the fact that so many people wanted Resident Evil to kind of turn paranormal. They wanted Leon to fight ghosts again. They wanted, you know, they wanted that for the remake. But one of the things that I've always appreciated about Resident Evil is that it's always grounded in, like, I guess sci-fi, you know, pseudoscience, right? It's always like that, right? It's always kept grounded. So it's never that there's like paranormal stuff happening. That's like, no, it's not Silent Hill. That's not it. So, you know, one of the examples that I'll give is even like with House Beneviento and Resident Evil 8 Village. That's actually an area that if you guys saw my review of Resident Evil 8, you guys know that I did not like that section, mostly because it just felt like a walking simulator. You know, it felt like a walking simulator. And even though, again, Resident Evil always has that, they're always grounded in like science, right? Where I guess pseudoscience, because of course these things don't exist. So it's like more like in the sci-fi realm. You know, they did explain that, you know, the Ethan basically got drugged going through that garden section, the cemetery section. And so, you know, inhaling all of those vapors, he basically started hallucinating. But the biggest issue for me with that section of Resident Evil 8 was the fact that Ethan was literally fighting nothing. But I guess just to keep a long story short here, you know, they were basically really pushing the boundaries of Resident Evil and Resident Evil 8 Village. Now, the reason I mention all of that is because in this DLC for Separate Ways, when it came to the Verdugo fight or the Pesanta fights, I thought it was done tastefully. Mostly because, you know, Eder was, on the one hand, she was, you know, seeing hallucinations of Pesanta, and they did give that scientific explanation that the virus or the Las Plagas infection that Pesanta has essentially gives her victims, you know, hallucinations. But the reason it was done tastefully was mostly due to the fact that Eder was able to fight those hallucinations. You know, that's something that I did not appreciate in House Beneviento. I thought House Beneviento was one of the dumbest sections, even in Shadow of Rose, because for starters, I don't think it was scary. And second, again, that is subjective to me. You know, that is just my opinion of it. But second, the other thing that I honestly really did not like, and this is not an opinion, is the fact that it was more of a walking simulator. You know, you basically all your guns are taken away in both House Benevientos and Shadow of Rose, and as well as RE8 Village. And I did not like that, because Resident Evil has always been that, you know, you have to, it's always been a survival horror game, not a horror game. So the fact that, you know, in separate ways, when you're fighting Pesanta, you don't feel completely defenseless. And it's actually part of the story that Eder still fights off the hallucinations while also fighting the actual enemy, and she wins. You know, so even though she's seeing hallucinations of like several verdugos or pesantas popping up, she still survives those encounters. You know, at the end of the day, Ada's a survivor, you know what I mean? And that just goes to show her skill level. So if anything, going back to what I was saying, I thought that the separate ways, it gets a pass for me. You know, even though I don't like it when they go too much into the hallucination side, the fact that you still had control of your character, you could still fight, you know, you could even snipe, you know, you can counter hallucinations and they would disappear. It's like, oh yeah, your brain goes back to normal kind of a thing. Even though I'm not a big fan of the hallucination, I still think that it was done tastefully compared to, like, for example, Shadow of Rose or like Resident Evil Village, which I thought did it horribly, because in those games, as mentioned, it wasn't really survival horror because they took away your weapons. It was more just playing on that horror side, which, as mentioned, you know, Resident Evil has never been like that. Even going all the way back to the first Resident Evil in 1996, where even if you ran out of bullets, you still had your knife. So yeah. So again, that's one of the things that, you know, even though when I was playing it, I was kind of like, oh, I don't really like this. At the end of the day, it wasn't a distraction for me. I still had a good time playing separate ways, even though I'm not a fan of that hallucination stuff. It's still, you know, as mentioned, it was done tastefully. So now we'll actually move on to the things that I really loved about this DLC. And for starters, the one thing that I actually want to talk about, that I have to talk about, is the fact that the hook gun was a tool that was actually used a lot more compared to the OG separate ways. So in the OG, you know, Eda could go into new locations with her hook gun. That's obviously apparent in the remake DLC. But what I really liked about this DLC is that the fact that you could use your hook gun in a fight. As mentioned before, I really liked how, you know, if you bought the charm, the little Eda charm, and added it to your briefcase, it could change the whole game up, which was really interesting. I also really love the fact that, you know, they also added it in just normal fighting. So, you know, if you were close enough to an enemy after shooting them in the leg, you know, you could kick them, but if you're far out of range of that, you close the distance for a punch. So if anything, I really love the aspect of the hook gun being more utilized in the remake DLC. Now, the other thing that I also have to talk about, I have to discuss, especially since my channel is literally called Project Wesker, was Wesker's involvement in separate ways. I honestly really, you know, I thought it was very interesting, their approach with adding Wesker in, you know, not just being in comms throughout the whole separate ways mission for Eda, but actually showing up and helping Eda at times and actually doing other stuff in the shadows. It's very, you know, when I was playing the game, it honestly kept bringing me back to Wesker's first appearance in Resident Evil and Resident Evil 1, where he was always doing that. You know, Wesker was also going through the mansion, but he was, you know, obviously keeping an eye on Chris and Jill, but also doing other stuff. So it honestly fits the character really well that he would actually be there in person on the island, you know, not only on the island, but also in the village and the castle, right? Yeah, doing all of those things kind of just begs the question, you know, were the developers thinking of making another Separate Ways kind of a DLC, but with Wesker? You know, could we get that where we kind of get like Wesker's report, or even not like a DLC, but even like a Wesker report of him going through, you know, the village section or whatever, going through like the castle, keeping up on Eda, you know, doing all that stuff, and kind of getting us, you know, a story as to what happens after the events of Resident Evil 4, since obviously, you know, they did change things up, especially with, you know, Krauser is how Wesker is able to extract the Las Plagas virus to be used in Resident Evil 5. So seeing more of Wesker is something that I always want to see, because again, I'm such a huge fan of Wesker. You know, I guess all of my viewers are, you know, we're all Wesker bros. He's such a great villain. You know, it was honestly a treat to be able to see so much Wesker in this DLC. The other thing that I also wanted to talk about was the El Gigante fight in the farm section. It's interesting that they incorporated that into the story, where they essentially had, Eder, interrupt the El Gigante from showing up at the villa. Can you imagine if we were in the story of Leon and, you're fighting all of the ganados and all of a sudden El Gigante shows up in the villa and like in a close quarters area? That would have been sick. That would have been like amazing to do. So the fact that we got that in separate ways, they incorporate that in the story so that Eder interrupts the El Gigante from, attacking Luis, Ashley, and Leon, was a really great boss fight. I really loved the fact that not only did he destroy buildings, because that's always been a part of Resident Evil 4, right? Even going back to the OG Resident Evil 4 story and as well as separate ways. That wasn't really what I liked about this fight. The thing that I really liked was the fact that the game gave you options from going to one building to another building. And if you stayed on a building long enough, that Gigante would literally break that building as you were on it. So that was really cool. I loved how, the longer you played in that section, the whole farm could literally be destroyed, except for the windmill, of course. But really fun. But at the end of the day, I had a fantastic time playing through that boss fight. Another thing that I honestly really loved about Separate Ways was the music. Even as I was streaming live, a lot of my viewers were mentioning how the save theme music was even better than the original story for the remake. And I gotta say, it's kind of true. It's the new theme, the new save theme for Eder is pretty fire. On top of that, I also really liked how, as Eder was going through stealth sections of the game, they would actually play like Bond music. There was a huge, you could definitely hear a huge inspiration from the Bond films, incorporated into the music for Eder, which makes sense, as I've stated in my while I streamed the game when the game first released. But I really liked that aspect. If anything, the only time it was kind of distracting was when you were doing stealth attacks, because as many of you guys know, Resident Evil is not known as a stealth game, and the stealth in Resident Evil games is really bad. Like, there were so many sections in Separate Ways where, the enemies would just be looking the other way, and then, you have to just crouch and hit the other enemy. But Resident Evil isn't known for stealth, so it gets a pass. But I really love the music taste in the Resident Evil games. I also really like too how they added the flamenco, shooting gallery song with Luis as well. Another thing that was also super funny that I have to mention was the fact that when you go to the castle section, like near the end of the castle section, right before you go on to the island section of the game, a lot of you guys caught this on stream, but I remember it was all serious and stuff, where Eder was actually looking for Krauser, and Eder basically says along the lines of, how did Krauser get up there so fast? And then all of a sudden it shows a close-up of Krauser where he's literally skipping up the building and running to get Ashley. And then after he gets Ashley, he also starts to skip to get out of the island and go to the boat section, which I honestly thought was so hilarious. I don't think that scene was supposed to be funny, obviously. But oh my gosh, yeah, that just looked really dumb. Just seeing a skipping Krauser going down the stairs. I don't know, guys. Let me know down in the comments if you guys also thought that scene was pretty funny. But yeah, the other thing that I honestly really appreciated as well with this DLC that I really loved was the fact that the knife was very OP. So I was playing the first playthrough, as mentioned, I played on hardcore, and I noticed, wait a second, some of the boss fights I could literally, once I ran out of like all of my, my ammunition for the guns that do a lot of damage, I would honestly just switch to my knife and I could win the fight just with my knife. So I honestly really like that they did that. It kind of just reminds me of how Krauser was in the OG Resident Evil 4, where if you used a knife on him, he would literally die like immediately. He would just fall like a sack of potatoes. And that was the same case when fighting U3, when fighting Pesanta, when fighting Sadler, even with your knife. It almost does more damage, which was very interesting. But let me know your guys' thoughts as to that as well. Very curious. The other thing that I also really liked about this DLC was the fact that we got more of Luis. Having more scenes with Luis Serra, was really awesome, you know, especially since Luis, you know, him dying in the remake you know, just like in the OG, it sucks, you know, but even in the remake story, like the original, like Leon story side of things, I really liked how they kind of just extended his life even more. And the fact that we're seeing even newer scenes, his interactions with Eder was really funny, honestly. I really liked how he was kind of just hitting on Eder, like from the get-go, you know what I mean? Which was really cool. I mean, you can't not, you know, hit on Eder, you know what I mean? Like she, damn boy, but, but anyways, I really loved how, you know, we just got to see more of the character of Luis Serra. So yeah, that's something that I honestly really liked. So now we'll actually move on to my nitpicks for Resident Evil 4. And it is worth noting that a lot of these nitpicks are my opinions. So very curious if you guys agree with them or you disagree with them, let me know down in the comments. But for starters, since we were just talking about Luis Serra, that's one of my first nitpicks that I had was the start of the Separate Ways DLC. I found it incredibly cringe that Luis just starts to dance flamenco in his jail cell, you know, next to, you know, another dead prisoner, I guess. I thought that that was the wrong setting, the wrong location for that scene. It would have made a lot more sense if it was just another scene, you know, from the dozens of scenes where we have Leon, or not Leon, but Eder speaking with Luis. You know, if Luis just to cheer Eder up or whatever starts doing a flamenco dance. I don't know. Just for me, I thought that scene right there didn't make any sense. Even when at the end that he goes up to his I guess his co-roommate, right, the other dead prisoner, he goes up to him and he says, you know, parece que me toca bailar, you know, whatever, and it just, or that translates to, you know, it seems like it's my turn to dance. I just thought it was cringe. It was not a great introduction. I know that was the start of the DLC, but I thought that the setting for that scene was way too forced. It could have been done differently in a different area in the DLC. But yeah, that's one of my nitpicks, especially. And the other also weird thing that I found too was that after Luis started dancing, he actually, as soon as the guards show up and they look like they're going to take him away somewhere else, he almost gets into a weird fighting dance position, which is something that we've never seen Luis do. Like he gets into this position where it looks like he's about to do like flamenco. I don't know. I just thought that this scene was just cringe, you know. And even after when Eder was literally, you know, after he finds out that Eder saves him, you know, and then he does that twirl, it felt a little much. That could have been done in a different location. But anyways, I don't know. Maybe it's just me. Again, this is just my opinion, but I thought it was cringe. Let me know if you agree. Another nitpick that I had as well with the control side of the game was, and this is very interesting, I actually didn't double check this to see if maybe because I am playing on the second control settings, so let me know if it's just my controller, but I noticed that for Ada's like hook gun thing, you have to press R1 to basically use her hook gun thing. So I was actually very confused because certain times R1, you can also run with R1, which is a very strange button. But the nitpick that I had was regarding the control of her hook gun. So in PlayStation, for my control setting, to shoot up, you know, to use her hook gun, you have to press R1. And the weird thing is that R1 is also the button to reset the camera angle, like to reset it wherever you're looking, it'll just reset it to where the character's looking. And it's also a button to use when you're running. So what would happen is that I'd be running, and then while I'm looking up trying to press R1, sometimes it would just readjust my camera to the left just because I wasn't looking directly at the R1 button. And so there was some times where it's just like, oh, the R1 button's not working. I have to look at it, like really focus on where I'm clicking. So I don't know if that was just me. Maybe, as mentioned, I'm very curious to see. I didn't double check if, you know, it's just my control scheme, because I am playing with, like, I think the control scheme 2. So where I'm pretty sure it only changes the circle button to be the crouch button. It switches circle to R3. So I don't know. I thought that was a weird button to use. And if that was the button that they wanted to use, they should have canceled the running with R1, and as well as the resetting of the camera with R1, and just replace that with something else. But I don't know. That was just, again, a very small nitpick. Another nitpick that I also had regarding the controls, and especially with the hook gun, was when you would actually, you know, close the distance with an enemy, sometimes it would glitch. Like, for example, there was even a time when I was playing in the Mercenaries where I was going down the stairs and, you know, I turned around, shot an enemy, and then used the hook gun, you know, from far away, zoomed in to close the distance. It actually, instead of me hitting the enemy at the bottom of the stairs, and almost, because I was at an angle, it honestly showed Eder move to like the left of like the bars of the stairs, which I thought was weird. Like, or sorry, not on the left, but on the right of the stairs. So it was just really weird. Sometimes you would find those glitches. I think that probably, I'm not a game designer, but that could have been polished probably a little bit more, in my opinion, for those like weird errors. But again, as mentioned before, that's something that I honestly still really liked. I really liked how the fact that they added the hook gun, you know, the ability to close the distance with kicks, or I guess with the punch and other stuff like that. So, or ripping the shield. So yeah, as mentioned, this is just a small nitpick. Now, the other nitpick that I honestly had was regarding the U3 boss battle. You know, this is something that even as I was playing it live with everybody, I thought it was a bit weird that they didn't give you the option, because in the OG, for starters, in the OG, when you fight U3 with Leon, you can actually decide where you're going to shoot the U3. So if you're going to shoot him in the face, or you're going to shoot the tail first. And whichever you shoot first, that body will just start dangling throughout the rest of the fight. So for example, if you shoot the body of the U3 in the OG, the tail will take control of the rest of the body, and the body will just, you know, the guy's upper body will just literally just start dragging on the floor as you're fighting the tail, and vice versa if you decide to kill the tail first and then fight the body. That was something that I was expecting to be a part of this DLC, the separate ways, and I quickly found out that that was not the case. You know, if you shot the tail or the body, it didn't matter. You know, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but I was trying this. Again, I was playing on hardcore, so that was a very hard boss fight the first time around. But but the thing that I honestly really didn't like was the fact that they split that one boss fight into two. So it's almost like the Separate Ways remake makes you defeat the body first, and then it splits it to another boss fight to fight the tail. When I would have preferred it if it was like the OG, where you could decide whether you shoot the tail or you shoot the upper body, and whichever you shoot will just be limp throughout the rest of the fight while you fight the other section. And that's just combined into one boss fight rather than split into two. So yeah, I'm not, as mentioned, that's just a nitpick that I had. Let me know if you guys agree with that, because as mentioned, not a big fan of them splitting such an iconic fight into two. You know, the second part of that fight was kind of just lame in my opinion, because we're just fighting the tail, and I don't know, I wasn't a big fan of it. Another nitpick that I also had was it kind of sucked that we didn't see, you know, Wesker, Krauser, and Eder all working together. We didn't see that. We didn't have, and because we didn't get that, we also didn't get a Krauser fight. And this is something that I stated even in my review and my playthrough of the remake, you know, RE4 story, is that it wouldn't make sense to be able to fight Krauser, especially since there's a whole dramatic scene of Leon killing Krauser that they added in the remake. So I was very curious to see how that played out in the DLC, even though I wasn't expecting it. And sure enough, that did end up being the case. And they kind of just kept Wesker and Eder separate from Krauser's, you know, story. And the one thing that I'll mention on that is that even though we didn't get Wesker, Eder, and Krauser talking, there was a very weird scene that we actually discussed live on the channel when we were playing through that section, where Eder and Wesker start talking on top of that tower, where Eder's with the sniper rifle. And you get a scene, and you do get a quick scene of Wesker kind of smiling at Krauser as Krauser goes into the building. So, as discussed in the stream, it almost looks like Wesker and Krauser do know each other. And I also thought it was interesting that they used Krauser's body to extract the virus for Resident Evil 5 story. So, but if anything, my biggest nitpick here is that I would have liked to have seen Wesker, Krauser, and Eder kind of talking to each other. Like, could you guys imagine if we got like the same comms room scene where we have Eder, you know, Krauser spinning the knife, and then Wesker shows up and kind of talks to both of them? That would have been something I would have liked to have seen, rather than what we got in the Separate Ways DLC. The other thing that I also mentioned in my live stream, which I have to mention here, that was one of my nitpicks, was the scene where we have Eder meeting Ashley. I thought that was very awkward. It almost seemed like they added that scene, that specific scene, into like the final boss area for like they added it in post, because I don't know, Ashley's interaction with Eder was very strange. She just goes, "Leon needs help," and then she just continues staring off into the distance looking at Leon, and it's like, okay, it was just very awkward, and it just looks like it was definitely added in post. But yeah, that was just a weird scene. I would have liked it if they had met or they had talked to each other, if they had known who, you know, because we never get a scene of where Ashley meets Eder, and that was not it. That was not a meetup. That was just literally Leon needs help, and then just that's it. That's the end of it. So that was definitely weird. The other thing that I have to talk about, and this is honestly a pretty big nitpick, this is honestly talking about Martinico. This was actually a new boss that was never a part of the OG Resident Evil 4, and to be honest, I thought it was a huge wasted opportunity with this new enemy type. You know, and for those of you that don't know, Martinico is the new big boss guy that's basically invulnerable to all of your gunfire, and is the guy that you meet in the comms section, or aka the laser, you know, facility section of I guess it's not the island. It's like the outer island, because you have to take the gondola all the way across to that smaller island. So yeah, that enemy type was one of the dumbest additions, the dumbest parts of this DLC. You know, I really did not appreciate the fact that we got a new boss, you know, we got a new enemy type, but we literally can't kill him. You know, at the end of the day, it almost seemed like the game director had to go to the bathroom, because it looked unfinished. Like, they obviously put time and effort into the enemy's design, into like the backstory for the enemy. But then when it came to the execution, again, it seemed like the game director had to go to the bathroom, mostly due to the fact that all he was just an invulnerable enemy that you can't hurt, and he was literally, at the end of the day, he was just used to make the laser cutscene where Eder uses her hook gun to go through the laser room. It's just more epic. It just wasn't great, like, at all. Like, I honestly would have liked if Eder had fought, you know, Martinico, and he wasn't, you know, invulnerable, but he honestly had, I don't know, something different about him. But yeah, making him invulnerable so that you're just running away from him, and then he just gets used to make that cutscene more epic, was incredibly lame. But very curious to hear your guys' thoughts on that as well. But at the end of the day, my final review score for Separate Ways DLC definitely has to be a 9.5. It could have been higher, and it could have probably made the jump to 10 if they had dropped the hallucination aspects of the Pesanta fight. But as mentioned, you know, it wasn't enough to distract me from the story, and I thought that it was just passable. You know, it was decent the way that they handled the Pesanta fights. So yeah, I do feel comfortable with giving it a 9.5. Now, if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to click this video if you guys want to see my review of Resident Evil Death Island, and click this video if you guys want to see my review of Resident Evil 4 Remake. Anyways, thank you so much for watching.